President Trump and Apple CEO Tim Cook announcing an additional $100 billion manufacturing deal. Joining us now, CNBC contributor Walter Isaacson. He's written books on Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. You know, when we intro you, Walter, and we start talking about who you've written books, I want to keep going because the list is like mind-boggling. Who else? So Da Vinci, who else?
You know, Jennifer Doudna's the one you got to watch because she's the one who created the gene editing technology, CRISPR.
That's another one.
Just as consequential. She's great.
Yeah. You are also an advisory partner at Perella Weinberg and a professor at Tulane University. Can you I know you're next, you wrote about Steve Jobs, but you know so much about Elon and Apple and everything else. What do you think of Tim Cook's navigating the President Trump and the administration? I think it's pretty
good. He's pretty good. It's very straightforward. You know, he's not one of these emotional people who wants to be the best bro of the president of the United States or somebody who wants to have their hair on fire and be attacking him. And you look at Jamie Dimon, Tim Cook, people who know how to do that. More importantly, what he did is a good thing. The notion of, okay, we're going to bring some manufacturing back in America. You have to remember, Steve Jobs was fixated on that. He was obsessed about building factories in Fremont, California. He even picked the tone of white paint for the walls and the pastels for the machines. In the end, he's ousted. Eventually, it doesn't work making the manufacturing the machines there. But in America, we lose out on something if we're designing something like Apple phones in California and then throwing them over an ocean to have other people build them. You don't get the feedback loop you have when your engineers and designers are right there watching on the factory floor. That's what Steve Jobs believed in. That's what Elon Musk believed in.
How do we do? Is it feasible? Because that's the headline in just about every paper. The president wants to do it, but it's not feasible to build iPhones in this country. Can we piecemeal go towards that and start doing components? And can we eventually get there?
You can go piecemeal, but in some ways that's not the holy grail, because what Steve Jobs wanted to do was to control parts end to end when he did the original Macintosh, where he made it himself. Likewise, Elon Musk, when he took over Tesla, it had supply chains around the world. It was doing a chassis in England and battery packs in Thailand. He brings it all in. And then you have a better integrated product, and you have people who are designing and engineering it who know what it's like to manufacture it. And the answer to, can we do it in America? Of course we can. We can do it. We've always had an ability to do manufacturing. I must admit, it doesn't happen on your show much, but people ought to make mistakes every now and then. For about 30 years, this is the beginning of the 1990s, I was kind of in favor of free trade offshoring. I thought it would increase our wealth. In the end, I think it's important for us to have the capacity to go from the microchip to the phone to the glass on the front of the iPhone, whatever it may be. And in Louisiana, Mississippi, where I grew up, there used to be a lot of manufacturing. It would be great to bring some of that back to America, especially for high-end products.
Eventually you run into one of the most sacrosanct, theorems in economics is comparative advantage. You have to just throw that out the window. But is there some
necessarily. I'd put my
quasi pseudo? Can we do it some way and still stay faithful to that?
Yeah, obviously there's a tug. The tariffs have downsides, and indeed you want the comparative advantage. But when you have a global supply chain system, and that's what Tim Cook was an expert in when Steve Jobs in the late 90s decided he couldn't build factories in America, didn't want to, he hires Tim Cook, who knows how to orchestrate like a wizard complex supply chains. And yeah, there's an advantage. There's a comparative advantage of each country. You create more wealth. I would not be doing these scattershot, complicated tariffs that Trump is announcing and then unannouncing. But you want to put your finger on the scale and say, if you build in America, you got a 10% advantage or maybe a 15% advantage. And if you had something like that, you wouldn't be moving a whole lot of manufacturing back to America, but you'd be bringing some, because you say, when we talk comparative advantage, let's put our finger in the scale. just like other countries do.
This is Walter Isaacson 2.0. You've moved this way a little bit.
Well,
right?
I told you that. I mean, I know this always shocks people where you say, well, you said 20 years ago that you were a total free trader and you believed in the Davos Aspen consensus. I look at things. I look at how that created wealth. It was a wonderful system that made us richer. But it also hollowed out the fact that people who could buy a cheap flat screen TV set on a Sunday night at Walmart, they no longer had the chance to get on the bus to go to the factory the next morning and make a decent job. And so, I applaud a push to move manufacturing back to America, move all sorts of production back to America. I'm not wild about the scattershot way that President Trump is doing it, but I've been, I read Orrin Cass, I've been reading J.D. Vance, others. There is some sense to the fact that maybe those of us who believed in the Aspen Davos consensus that enshrined free trade as almost it was engraved on a tablet from either, a tablet and handed down to us from the gods. No, that didn't help a middle class in America.
Walter, I'm going to jump in here because we're watching Intel stock sink by 3.5% right now. President Trump just posting on Truth Social, the CEO of Intel is highly conflicted and must resign immediately. There is no other solution to this problem. Thank you for your attention to this problem. Again, the stock is down by 3.5%. This, of course, goes back to a letter that was sent to the Intel board chair, Yuri, by Senator Tom Cotton, questioning Lip-Bu Tan, the CEO of Intel's, his investments in China prior to being appointed to Intel. Also his ties, of course, to Cadence Design, which he had headed for a decade or so prior to Intel, and its sale of technology to a Chinese military academy. So we're seeing that stock down by 3.8%. So swift reaction here to this post.
Well, one reaction to that is if you want to take on China, and I don't, as I said, I can support some of these things happening, but I certainly don't like the, shoot first, ask questions later way Trump is doing it. But if you want to make sure you're not as beholden to China, you better start manufacturing chips in America.
Another reason. So, okay, good. Walter, you're reasonable. You're reasonable. So a lot of these, you would say that there are the latest news from Apple. This is a positive overall for obviously not just so the president can tout a headline, but for Corning it's a positive probably, for Apple maybe for the country and our workers.
Look at your iPhone. There was a time when Steve Jobs was inventing that, and he said, I want a really good piece of glass that won't smudge. They said, well, the Claves in China can't do it. He said, well, call Corning. And he called Wendell Weeks at Corning. This is 30-some-odd years ago. And they made a deal to make that Gorilla Glass. And it's important for somebody building a product in which he wants perfection, which means end-to-end control, that you try to do it where you're not just throwing the manufacturing specs across an ocean and hope that what comes back fits into your product.